For our final sort of initial speech, we're going to go to Mr. Watson in the negative. Go ahead, 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chair, and I appreciate it so much. And just since everyone did like a few minutes of introduction, I'll do like a very brief one. I'm Christian Watson. I'm the spokesperson for an organization called Color Us United. We're fighting for a race-blind society, and that's part of the reason why I'm very happy to be standing here and talking on all of you and not affirming the resolution today. You know, when we think of America as a nation, I like to approach it from a scientific point of view. How would a scientist dissect the word nation in America? There is no scientist of any sort, any zoologist that would ever understand a lion or a hippo by understanding them through the lens of them being simple animals, them being a part of animalia. They would look at that particular lion or hippo and they would try to analyze their appendages. They would try to analyze things that are particular to them. Similarly, I think so many people reject what I call the principle of variations, which shows us that America is much more than can be sort of contained in a single word. Walt Whitman said in Song of Myself that we all contain multitudes, or at least that he contained multitudes. And I think the term America itself most certainly contains multitudes that I would say are divine. The same kind of America you get in Los Angeles is not the same kind of America you get in New York City. The same kind of America you get in New York City is not the same kind of America you get in Idaho. There are just so many differences in America. There are so many cultural, geographical differences that play into what it means to be an American, which is why, part of the reason why I have such a problem with the resolution, because it asks a simple question, a sort of singular dimension question about a multidimensional concept, which is America. But just because we are variated and just because we are different and pluralistic does not mean there's no commonality amongst us. Herein comes the American idea. The American idea is the fundamental proposition bequeathed through Locke from Hugo Grotius, going through the 17th century and coming out into the Constitution, that every single human being is created equal. Every single human being has inalienable natural rights. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard this before, and many of you and many people say or think, well, you know, that may be true, but how was that treated at the time the Constitution was conceived? You know, only in America can you have a nation so complex that the person who penned the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, both seemingly allowed slavery to happen, but also himself married a slave. And then in his biographies, in his notes, called slavery an execrable, very bad institution. Only in America can you have a man like Frederick Douglass, who was born into nothing on a plantation, who comes up to be one of the greatest orators in the history of this country. Only in America can you have a colony of freedmen who are formerly in chains, 12 years later, go ahead and start the greatest testament to individual genius that was Greenwood, Tulsa, and one of the shining examples of success at that point in time in history, only in America. And this is not just because these people were standing in spite of their struggles. This is because the American ideal is integrated into the fabric of our existence. The American ideal is not a political principle merely. It becomes a political principle through process. The American ideal is a natural principle that each and every one of us can tap into. And that natural principle stands above any singular event. And that natural principle stands above any singular condition. That natural principle is something that transcends any power structure. That's why the King George, was a target in the American Revolution, because he thought that he had the cradle of value. He thought that he had the sort of zenith of authority. He thought that he had the right to determine these things for human beings. But we showed through reason and then through the application of that reason, that was a fundamentally false idea. America, my friends, I would submit to you, can never be a racist nation, because the natural condition of human equality can never be racist. Can America, that natural condition of human equality, interact with racist actors? Oh, yes. Can it be besmirched by racist actors? Oh, yes. But the good thing about natural conditions is that no one can deprive you of them. The good thing about natural conditions is that no legislator can will them away. The good thing about natural conditions is that each and every one of us have access to them. So when I see people say that America is racist or America had a racist past, I see people who have lost sight of what the American ideal is. And I've lost sight ultimately of what the American ideal means to existence in life. The American ideal is not some abstract principle. If it was some sort of abstract principle, you would never have had Frederick Douglass. You would never have had the Civil Rights Movement. You would never have had any of that. All of that are consequences of that fundamental natural principle. And so it is for that reason that I stand in firm rejection of the resolution. And I thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, wonderful. Jazz hands for Mr. Watson. Very good. Okay, so once again, we will go with a panelist question and then attendee questions. So first for a panelist, Mr. Ballou, got your hand right up there. Let's hear it. You're muted.
Madam Chair, I'm just celebrating all of the speakers, and if there were any lack of energy, Christian cleaned up for all of us.
Didn't he though?
He killed it.
I was just thinking that, yes.
He was on fire. So thank you for sharing that, Christian. And we know that you're a student of philosophy, and your representations on Locke's idea of the inalienable right of liberty, right? If you could talk a little bit about that concept and closing the gap between what is and what is ideal. Because I think that one of the things that every panelist prior to yourself has agreed to is that, hey, historically, there was a gap. So again, if you could just talk a little bit about how in your construct we close that
In his
gap.
construct, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one thing about history is that we tend to reject, as I mentioned before, the principle of variation and see all of history on this single scale. So when we see Jim Crow, we don't see the people or the faces or the conditions, all of them, which went under Jim Crow. We simply see Black struggle, Black pain, Black failure. We don't see the thousands of Black people, the millions of Black people who actually beat back the system and thrived on the American ideal of natural equality and human reason in spite of those limitations. So I want us to understand that's what Locke was talking about. I think Locke was fundamentally talking about our nature as human beings. This is what he mentions. He talks about the state of nature, how in this sort of natural state of being, we all have these rights and we go into society to enshrine and protect them. So I think that Locke was actually talking about not just an ideal. He was describing a condition. He was describing the physiology of man's nature. And when I say man, I'm not trying to exclude women. I'm just saying as a general term, man's nature. And that truth is enduring regardless of any condition that has happened. Now, that truth can be assaulted, it can be attacked, it can be ignored, it can be defamed. But you cannot stop that truth from existing any more than you can stop a man from breathing and keep him alive. It's just something that is ingrained in our nature. It's a fundamental principle of the universe, and it has always existed. It may not have always been observed, but it has always existed, and it will always exist. And that's why I think America is an enduring concept.
All right. So we will now go to attendee questions. We're going to start with a fellow named Steve. There are two Steves here. One of you had a question about Tulsa. Whichever one of you that is, please unmute and ask your question. Maybe there's a tech issue. I think just since there are multiple Steves, I'm just going to go ahead and read the question. So the question is for you, Mr. Watson, is why did the Tulsa massacre occur?
Because there were some demented souls with dark hearts who decided to go ahead and burn down the creations of people who were living peacefully because they were jealous, they were envious. If you look at Tulsa, almost all the residents were much richer than most of the other residents of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the entire state. Many of the residents had their own fleet of private airplanes. There was just a immense amount of success, and there were certain individuals who thought that success was not warranted. But I think that when we say Tulsa happened and it was perpetuated by white folks, because it was perpetuated by white folks, we kind of missed the point. It wasn't the fact that the poor people were white is not the issue. The fact that people were envious, jealous, and didn't recognize the equal rights of those Black people in that part of the city, that's the issue, and that is an affliction that is transracial and can impact all of us. That's the real story out of Tulsa, not that white supremacy reigned supreme at that point in time and destroyed Black excellence. No. It's that hatred in general, which is a human condition. It exists everywhere. Decided to go ahead and it unfortunately won in that particular moment.
All right. And for a final question, we're going to go to Ms. Amy. And forgive me, Amy, I'm forgetting your last name. But she's actually working the debate tonight. So Amy, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If the speaker would briefly assume that many opportunities in America require historical access, whether it be credit history of your parents and yourself to apply for FAFSA, inherited wealth to support yourself through college, the quality of your local schools, and ensuring that you qualify for college, would a history of absence of access qualify as systemic racism? And if you would please elaborate as to why or why not.
How you phrased it, no. Absence of access in general, no, because I don't think access has anything necessarily to do with race. Now, I think there can be a case to be made that for a very, very long time, there were certain ethnicities that were shut out of particular parts of society, like universities, and that hurt them. But when people say that, I think that number one, historical context is very important. Again, the conditions in 1960, 1970, or even before then, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, are not the conditions of right now. There have been a deluge of programs that have helped Black Americans get into college, and I think they've actually kind of hurt more than helped. It's just affirmative action, and they have kind of sort of tried to address what they saw as inequality. But there's also one more important thing as well. There are so many different reasons as to why you mentioned credit, as to why certain populations in certain areas may have lower credit that may have nothing to do with race. So I think that again we have a tendency to see all disparities as coming out from a racist thing, coming out from a racist origin, and that's just not the case. I think that if you measure disparities by race, you will be able to try to convince yourself or convince others that it is racist. But I think those are two very different things. Measuring something by something and that something actually being that something are two very different things.
All right. And with that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands for our final speaker of the night. Thank you. Good.